Hey folks, welcome to this special DAC battle. If you haven't already taken a look at the ADI-2 review that I posted recently, this is an extension of that review. So I might assume some information here that I've talked about in that review. You may want to watch the review of the ADI-2 first, and possibly even the review of the Chord Qutest first, before you look at this comparison. Unless of course you've done your own reading, you're already familiar with these two, and you just want to know how they stack up against one another, because that's all this one is about, is how does the Chord Qutest here stack up against the RME ADI-2. Now straight off the bat you can see that the Qutest is much smaller in footprint than the ADI-2, and to me that's both a pro and a con. The Qutest is a brilliant feeling piece of kit. It's really solid, it's machined out of aluminium I believe, and it just feels and looks great. But it's very small, and I often find that it's kind of lost a bit in a stack of equipment when the amplifiers can be quite large, and it means that when you have the cables coming out of the Qutest, they're draped a long way over the back of the amplifier. It's not a huge deal, but it's something I'm not necessarily a fan of, so I thought I'd mention it. The ADI-2 on the other hand is a little bit bigger. It's still not huge. It's not even as deep as something like the THX789 amplifier, which is quite compact. It's a similar width to the 789 for those that are familiar. So it's relatively small and compact still, but it just feels a little bit better in size to me than the Qutest. Again, it's a very minor detail. For many people, something like the Qutest is going to sit on a shelf and never be touched, never be thought about, but I do like the fact that the ADI-2 is a bit more substantial in terms of its footprint and its ability to sit well with other equipment. Another glaring difference between the two is that in the case of the Qutest, you've got the little viewing window that changes color depending on the source frequency you're listening to, and two buttons, and that's it. Source and filter. So it's a very simplistic design. That's part of its charm, but it's also part of its limitations when put up next to the ADI-2, where you've got a product that has so much versatility, whether it be the ability to drive headphones and IEMs, or the ability to display a lot of information that you might find interesting, as well as have the controls to change things like a parametric equalizer, the filters being used, which of course is in common, both have their own filter changes, but also things like crossfeed, balance control, you name it, the ADI-2 can probably do it, whereas the Qutest just does DAC duties. It creates sound from digital signals and you can change filters, and that's about it. If we swing them around to the back now, another striking difference between them is that you've got on the back of the ADI-2, you've got XLR connections and RCA connections, whereas on the back of the Qutest, you've only got RCA. Now, a good RCA implementation should be just as good as an XLR implementation. The only place that XLR is really important is in a situation where you're doing long runs of cables and you're likely to pick up noise through those cables as they're acting like antennas. For most home setups, that really shouldn't be an issue. However, in the case of the ADI-2, the XLR sound quality does seem to be slightly better than the RCA. So for all sound quality comments in this comparison, I am talking about the RCA outputs from the Qutest and the XLR outputs from the ADI-2, just to make that clear across the board. The other thing you might notice here is that on the Qutest, we don't have a coaxial input. What we have instead is two BNC inputs. Now, BNC is actually my preferred input for coaxial sound, and that's because BNC connections are a 75 ohm connection. What that means is that you can have an output, assuming you've got BNC on your source, you can have an output all the way through to the DAC at 75 ohms consistently. Whereas when you're using coaxial, such as on the ADI-2, you are actually risking having some reflections and therefore some noise created where there are different impedances along the chain. RCA connections are not 75 ohm. You may have them connected to a 75 ohm cable, but that means you've got at least two barriers along the way where there are changes in impedance, and that can cause very, very tiny reflections that produce noise within your signal. It's a minor point, but some people will say it's enough to make a difference in the sound. I'm not going to comment in detail on that because I haven't done enough comparisons to say definitively either way, but it's something worth considering that from a physics point of view, as I understand it, BNC is a better option because you can have that consistent impedance matching from end to end. Other than that, both units have USB input, they both have optical input, so really similar DAC input stages. It's more the output side of things that gets really different because you've got RCA only here, whereas you've got balanced out, RCA out, as well as the headphone amp built in on the ADI-2. So we've got a jack of all trades here that does everything very, very well versus a specialist here that just does the DAC stage only and lets everything else be taken care of by external components. Keeping in mind that you're paying a little bit more money for the Qutest compared to the ADI-2, and straight away you're starting to see that from a value proposition point of view, the ADI-2 is giving you more bang for buck in terms of features and functions, whereas the Qutest relies entirely on sound quality to justify its value.
Don't take it personal, I ain't lying, I ain't hiding, I've been grinding, multiplying, I've been trying to get my weight up, staying prayed up, meditating and taking time away. You always posting up pictures, trying to look like you winning. I'm writing rhymes in the kitchen, soaking in moments we live in, yeah. You got the nerve to be on me, faking your life for the IG. If you got my number, don't add me, cause baby, I'm on hiatus. I'm on hiatus. I'm on hiatus. I'm on hiatus. Baby, don't check for me. Taking time out to be.
It's quite simple to say that if you want an all-in-one system that is going to be a brilliant desktop DAC with a built-in headphone amplifier, and it's going to drive everything you need ever in terms of feeding external amplifiers, having a built-in headphone amp, having all of the controls, whether it's EQ, crossfeed, etc. The ADI-2 is the winner straight away. Don't even worry about the Qutest, just take it out of the picture. If, however, all you're actually looking for is a DAC that produces fantastic sound, then this next part of the comparison is the bit that's really going to matter to you. Now, what I did to test these was I hooked them up, feeding them both with a coaxial signal. I also tried them with USB signals using the same USB cable, but that did involve a little bit of time in between switching across from one to the other. And I did that so as to avoid the potential of a USB cable influencing the sound. And so I did comparisons across multiple styles of input to make sure I was hearing the same thing each time, and the differences weren't coming down to a source or cable influence. The products I used for the testing were, of course, the Qutest and the ADI-2. I connected those up to the Sparkos Labs Aries amplifier that I reviewed a little while ago. That thing is an absolute beast and incredibly transparent, so it was going to allow me to hear anything there was to hear in terms of differences in sound between the two. Finally, as I mentioned before, the Qutest was connected to the Aries using its RCA connections, whereas the ADI-2 was connected using XLR. Now, if anything, that should give a slight edge to the ADI-2 for those that believe that balance is inherently better. In my experience, the single-ended output on the Qutest is so good that I don't think it's an issue at all, and definitely from what I heard in my testing of the ADI-2, the RCA output from the ADI-2 is a little bit inferior to the XLRs. So I wanted to give the ADI-2 the best possible chance by using its maximum sound quality output. In the case of the Qutest, there is only one choice, so I stuck with that. Because both of these devices have filters built in, I wanted to make sure the filtering was consistent as well. In the case of the Qutest, I had it on its simplest filter, which is the incisive neutral filter, the white filter. In the case of the ADI-2, I left it on what it calls SD sharp, which is the default on the box, so I left it on that so as not to have too many variables going on. I have to say the filters on the ADI-2 don't make a huge amount of difference. Similarly, the filters on the Qutest only make a tiny bit of difference as well. So I don't think it's going to make a huge change in the comparison, but I did want to mention all of my settings so that all of you understood. For the testing, I moved between multiple headphones, including the Meza Empyreans, as well as the Focal Clears, and I think at one stage I even plugged in the AudioPhile AF1120 Mark IIs. So I tried across a wide range of different headphones with brighter sounds, warmer sounds, very neutral sounds, in order to make sure I was hearing everything I could to split these two and say definitively, at least for me, which one I thought was the better sounding device to share that with all of you. Straight away, the thing that struck me the most about these two was the overall presentation differs slightly. The Qutest is the more intimate sounding device. It brings the music in a little bit towards you, but at the same time it creates a more circular soundstage. Whereas what I found with the ADI-2 was it creates more of a horizontal or flatter soundstage that's a little bit further back from you and probably feels a bit wider. I've read online that a lot of people feel like there's more air and more space in the ADI-2's presentation, and I think that's why. I think it's because of that width that it gives and that slightly greater space between the listener and the actual music presentation. For me though, I actually found I was hearing more space with the Qutest. It was just space presented differently. With the ADI-2, whilst the overall sound, the beginning of the soundstage, is a bit further back, the soundstage itself is actually narrower. So the depth overall is maybe that wide. Let's just use an arbitrary figure. So the depth is that wide and it maybe sits that far from my face, again arbitrary. In the case of the Qutest, instead of it sitting that far from my face, maybe it sits that far from my face, but the depth of it is a lot more. And so it changes the overall interpretation of the music, and it's going to be a reason that some people prefer the Qutest, some people prefer the ADI-2, depending on whether you like the width of soundstage at the sacrifice of some depth, and with it pushed back a little bit further in terms of the front of that soundstage where the singer might be, or in the case of the Qutest, where you don't mind it being a little bit more intimate and close to you, but you prefer that more three-dimensional sense of space within the soundstage. So I've used lots of words, lots of analogies there. Hopefully it's made it clear. The Qutest soundstage for me is closer, but it is bigger and rounder, not wider, just bigger overall. The ADI-2 is a little bit further away, it's wider, but it's not as deep. Personally for me, I prefer the Qutest presentation. I like a three-dimensional soundstage, and that's where the Qutest does that just a little bit better than the ADI-2. The Qutest gives a better sense of the space in the room and the room's shape and size itself. In terms of the tonal qualities of the two DACs, as you'd expect when you're talking about top-end DACs, they generally do most things pretty much the same. If a DAC is doing a really good job, there should be no glaring differences in terms of the sound signature. So there shouldn't be a strong treble emphasis or bass emphasis or anything like that. But because digital to analog audio is about more than just the measurements of things like distortion, and it's also about things like how the sound wave is reconstructed and the filters used to do that, the end result is that the Qutest and the ADI-2 have some noticeable differences in their presentation. At first glance, it's going to sound like the ADI-2 is probably the cleaner and more resolving unit of the two of them. But that to me is actually because there's a slight harshness to the treble, and it's really, really slight, and harshness is probably way too strong a word. But it's got a slight dryness, a slight etchedness to the treble that the Qutest doesn't have. At first glance, it may sound like the Qutest is a little bit soft and a little bit too relaxed, and it's lacking in detail. But as I spent a bit more time between the two of them, what I found was that all of the information was there in the Qutest, and in fact there was even more information there in the Qutest. It just wasn't being pushed in my face in quite the same way as the ADI-2 tended to do. And again, pushed in my face is probably too strong a term. It was just a little bit forward from the ADI-2, which made me go, oh, it's got more detail. But then as I listened more, I noticed that I couldn't get in through the music and hear the details that were resting in between the bigger notes. The Qutest, on the other hand, there was that space to do that. If you've watched my interviews with Rob Watts, he talks about the way his reconstruction filters work, and it's all about the ability to reconstruct those really fast transients in sound. And that's very much a part of how the Qutest DACs go about producing some of the subtle, really, really subtle details in terms of the space that the recording was made in. So the room and the ambient sounds, the very, very fine textural details of instruments, that's where to me the Qutest takes the edge over the ADI-2 in terms of overall sound quality. I think the presentation in terms of the soundstage stuff I spoke about before can be very much a case of one person's opinion over the other, where some will just like that more horizontal wide presentation of the ADI-2 compared to the slightly more intimate and 3D circular presentation of the Qutest. Whereas for me, the thing that definitely separates them and has me clearly preferring the Qutest is that the information contained within the music has more depth and detail in the Qutest than it does in the ADI-2. In fact, in my notes, one of the things I wrote down was that I found the treble from the Qutest had a greater sense of, in inverted commas, clearness. So not resolution, not detail, but clearness. I could hear it more clearly. It was more pure sounding. It didn't have that little bit of edge to it that the ADI-2 had, and so at first glance maybe didn't seem as detail oriented, but actually was easy to listen to and get all of the information from. I'm just going to take a quick sidestep at this moment and talk about an experience I had when I used to work at Bang & Olufsen. One of the things they did with their televisions, and yes, I know that's visual, but this will all make sense in a second. One of the things they did with their televisions was they focused their TV designs not on blowing people away with saturation and contrast, but on creating a visual that was as realistic as possible. Now, one of the challenges we had at B&O was that somebody would walk into a showroom having been to see Panasonics and Samsungs and similar TVs that are high on contrast and colour, particularly in the showrooms where their default or demo settings are quite dynamic and bright to attract attention. People would then come to B&O and say, oh, it looks a little bit washed out, it's not as dynamic, I don't like it. What B&O knew though was that as you live with that for longer, you actually are going to appreciate the more natural image, and in this case a more natural sound, compared to a more dynamic and in-your-face presentation. Now, I'm not for a second suggesting that the ADI-2 is designed for that simple retail wow factor. That's not what they're doing. They are producing a fantastic, high quality, very transparent and very resolving sound from an AKM DAC chip. The difference, I believe, is that the Qutest and the Chord Electronics approach to DACs means that you're actually getting more realism and more of those subtle nuances in the sound that at first glance aren't going to wow you because they're really, really subtle. It took a lot of listening for me to really separate these two and understand why the Qutest was a more relaxing listen. Every time I flipped between the two, it was like my shoulders would drop slightly and I'd just go, oh, that's just right. And I didn't necessarily know why at first, but as I listened more and more, it was that little bit more space that each instrument had around it. It was the ability to hear the weight of each note and the way a note would linger after the key or the string was struck. That's where the Qutest really separated itself for me from the ADI-2. Strangely, the more I listened, what I found was that whilst the Qutest is the more relaxed sounding DAC, it somehow was also more dynamic. There was a greater sense of depth and punch in the bass and a better sense of overall drive in the music as a result. A really good example was I was listening to a whole lot of music, but one of the tracks that came on was Vultures from the John Mayer Trio album Try. Flipping between the two DACs on that particular track was really quite eye-opening because the ADI-2 seemed to cut off some of the bass ambience. That particular recording has a bit of boom in the bass, it's a little bit loose, and you can almost hear the room and the space it's in because of the bass reverberating around it. In the ADI-2, it sounded almost like it was running out of breath and running out of steam to produce that bass. I don't believe that's what was actually happening. I think it was more about the way it's reconstructing the signal. The Qutest, on the other hand, I could hear the full reverberation of that bass. I could hear the looseness of it, which is intended to be there based on all of the different times I've heard that song reproduced from different systems. It just sounded more realistic and more like I was standing in the room listening to the John Mayer Trio play. Both, again, sounded fantastic. I wouldn't knock either of them, but definitely the Qutest to me had the better sense of realism once I got past that initial wow factor of the detail from the ADI-2, or the sense of detail from the ADI-2. Listening to instruments like pianos, the ADI-2 sounds clean and resolved and beautiful, but the Qutest sounds real. The Qutest has a little bit more of that harmonic richness that a piano is meant to actually have. And from my conversation with Rob Watts, all I can imagine is it comes down to the ability for the Qutest to reconstruct some of those transients that traditional off-the-shelf DAC chips just can't do. Ultimately, I think what's going on here is the ADI-2 has gotten the absolute most out of the AKM DAC chip that they're using, whereas the Qutest uses the in-house programmed FPGA chip using all of Rob Watts' career of research and programming expertise to reproduce this particular sound. Now, before I get people who are saying that I'm a Chord fan and I'm hating on the ADI-2, please make sure you've watched the review of the ADI-2. I think this is an incredibly good piece of equipment, and so just to make it clear for this comparison, if I only needed a DAC and all I wanted it to do was take a USB or a BNC coaxial or optical input and spit out an RCA signal, I would definitely choose the Qutest. It is the better sounding DAC, in my opinion, for pure DAC duties. However, the ADI-2 is far, far better as an all-in-one unit. It's incredibly powerful, incredibly capable, it's got a built-in amplifier, and so it's much, much, much better value for money. It smashes the Qutest in value for money. So for me, this all comes down to what are you looking for in the product? Are you looking just for a DAC? Have you got your headphone amplifier sorted already? Do you not need a built-in amplifier? Are you someone that doesn't ever use things like EQs, crossfeed, and those similar powerful features that are built into the ADI-2? If that's you and pure DAC is all you need, I think the Qutest is the choice. However, if you do want to play with EQs, if you do want to think about things like crossfeed, different outputs, having the ability to use it as a preamp with a variable output, being able to plug in headphones on the fly, then the ADI-2 is incredibly good value and is absolutely the product to choose. So that's really how I separate these two. Personally, if I had money to spend, depending on my use case, I would absolutely buy either of these, maybe even both of these, they are that good. In the case that you are just saying to me, Lachlan, what is the best possible sound quality I can get for under 2,500 Australian dollars, I'm going to hand you well, I'm not going to hand you a Qutest because I can't give them away for free, but I'm going to say to you, go out and buy a Qutest. It is going to give you, in my opinion, the best sound quality out of these two for under $2,500. Now, hopefully I haven't upset anybody with this review. As I said before, I'm not just a Chord fanboy. I am a huge fan of Chord, but I can also see the shortcomings in this device. It's limited in that it hasn't got XLR outputs. It's got no variable outputs if you want that. I find the form factor a little bit too small. So there's things I don't like about it, and I'm not blind to those. But after extended listening and giving both products a thorough chance with lots of different music and through multiple different sources being both coaxial and USB, I consistently came back to preferring the Qutest, but I would be completely happy forevermore if someone said, this is the only unit you can ever own, Lachlan, you've got to have the ADI-2 for the rest of your life as your DAC. I wouldn't bat an eyelid, I'd have a big smile on my face and off I'd go. So both are brilliant products. It all comes down to what exactly it is that you're looking to achieve. Pure audio quality or power, versatility, flexibility, and still outstanding audio quality. So I hope this helps you make a decision between the Qutest or the ADI-2. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget about the giveaway for the Moondrop SSR IEM. Just comment down below, make sure you're subscribed, and you'll be in the draw for that one when I announce it soon. But for now, happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.